Hello and welcome to the first webinar for the Emergency Volunteering Shared Learning Network. So the topic of this first webinar, or the title, is Emergency Volunteering 2030 Views from Volunteerism Managers. My name's Blythe McLennan. I'm a social scientist at RMIT University and I'll be presenting the webinar today. I also do research on volunteering for the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, and I'm a convener of the Emergency Volunteering Shared Learning Network. I just wanted to let you know this is actually a re-recording of the live webinar that we held on the 5th of February. Being our first webinar, we had a bit of a technical glitch in that the webinar wasn't being recorded when we thought it was. So I'm re-recording it now so that I can share it more widely. So this presentation is based on a report that at the time that I'm recording is about to be released. At the time you're watching this may very well have been released already. So there'll be a link on the final slide where you'll be able to access that report as soon as it's available. So the report is one in a series of environmental scan reports. This first report is based on interviews that my colleague Taryn Kruger and I did with managers who work in and around volunteering and volunteerism in emergency management organisations. And the purpose of those interviews was to hear from managers their views about how they understand the current landscape of emergency volunteering and the future or the emerging landscape, and what they see needing to happen to bring about a more preferred future for emergency volunteering. As I said, it's one of a suite of reports in an environmental scan. They form part of a research study called Emergency Volunteering 2030, Adapting the Sector. I'm not going to talk about that project too much other than to say that the question that we're hoping to answer and that we're seeking a quite wide stakeholder input to help us find answers to this question. That question is, how can the emergency management sector best enable the value of volunteering that supports communities before, during and after emergencies over the next decade? And we're gathering together a range of different views on that. So today I'm talking about views from managers of working in volunteerism in EM organisations, but we're also speaking with local government representatives, community sector organisations, volunteering peak bodies, and volunteer group representatives from volunteering groups and volunteer leaders from EM. Okay, I just wanted as well to clarify for you what I mean by emergency volunteering, because it's not a term that's commonly used. It's a term that we have made up, I guess, a definition for the purposes of our project. So for us, emergency volunteering is any and all volunteering that supports communities before, during and after a disaster or emergency. And that's regardless of its particular duration, so short or long term, or its particular organisational affiliation or its lack thereof. So we're looking at all kinds of volunteering that provides supports to communities. So this, certainly a very important part of that is formal volunteering with emergency management organisations. And for this webinar, that's a lot of the focus of the topic, because that's what managers working in those organisations, that's the form of volunteering that they are concerned with. But we are interested also in informal forms of volunteering that support communities, in formal volunteering that supports communities that happens outside of EM organisations. So a much wider field, spontaneous volunteering, short-term volunteering, all sorts of different varieties, digital, any kind of volunteering that supports communities is the scope that we are interested in looking at. Another term that I use and that I just wanted to specify is I talk about the landscape of emergency volunteering, and a key rationale for our research project is that that landscape is changing and that the emergency management sector needs to adapt to that. So I won't say too much about how it's changing. I'll show you a little bit about what managers have said about that. But this is sort of a mental model that I made to help me understand when I was analysing the interviews from managers of the different elements that they were talking about when they were discussing volunteering. So in the past, we've mostly focused on, or the discussions around emergency volunteering mostly focused on sort of these levels here. So volunteers themselves and volunteer motivations and management approaches. So that's sort of the recruitment, retention, engagement approaches towards volunteers in formal organisations. But in the interviews, managers really quickly started talking about other elements that shape and influence how people volunteer and the way volunteering is managed and how the shape of volunteering strategies and models in emergency management. So they talked about organisational contexts and how they impacted on volunteering. They talked about the context of the emergency management sector overall. They talked a lot about the external environment and how social, technological, economic, environmental, political, regulatory changes and shifts impacted on volunteering. They talked about communities and what was happening in communities and how they were changing and shifting, and they talked about other forms of volunteering that wasn't with their own organisations, affiliated with their organisations, and they talked about relationships between all of these elements as well. Since that time, I've realised there's another part of this mental model that is missing, and that was missing at the time because managers didn't talk about it very much, but others have done since, which is, if I can bring it up, this. So what's happening in the wider voluntary sector? So emergency management, volunteer-based emergency services form part of the wider voluntary sector. And a lot of the shifts and changes, challenges, opportunities, uncertainties impacting on volunteering around the emergency management sector are very, very similar to what's happening in the wider voluntary sector. There's also changes in the relationships of the voluntary sector with government and other shifts in the wider voluntary sector that also kind of impact and shape and contribute to this landscape of emergency volunteering. Okay, so we were asking managers with roles in volunteerism about how they saw this landscape and how it was shaping and what it currently looked at and what they think it's going to look like in the future. So this little diagram, or the graph here, just unpacks a little bit who we spoke to. So for this part of the research, we spoke to 34 people. I think all up, we've had input through interviews and questionnaires from around about or almost 150 people. So this is just a portion of the people that we've spoken to, but these are the managers. The blue colour there shows managers from primary response organisations and across the different jurisdictions. The orange shows managers we spoke to from emergency management organisations that are not primary response organisations, so we've called them support organisations. So a lot of those had roles in relief recovery and were non-government organisations. But the orange colour there is support EMOs, so support emergency management organisations that are volunteer involving. So they engage volunteers directly in their organisation. The grey, you'll see, they're support organisations that don't directly engage volunteers, but have some kind of role in coordinating, supporting, or enabling volunteering in some way. And I'll show you a breakdown of the organisations that these people were associated with so that you can see who makes up those groups. Something else I need to be very clear about is that the people that we've interviewed here, they are not all direct managers of volunteers. A lot of the people we spoke to are people that have roles in volunteer strategy, volunteer sustainability, and in support services for volunteering. So they weren't all direct managers of volunteers, although some of them were. So I'm using the term sort of volunteerism managers as a shorthand term to refer to this category of managers. It's a little bit confusing. It's not volunteer managers, volunteerism managers. I couldn't come up with a more distinctive term that kind of encapsulated this group, but But so volunteerism managers, not all direct managers of volunteers. I think that's important to keep in mind as we're going through. So these are the organisations that the people we interviewed were associated with. I'll let you have a little scan of those for yourself. I won't read through. As this is a scan and we're interested in looking at sort of trends and themes that go across the whole sector, we didn't go as deep and involve all the organisations that we would have liked to if we had endless time and resources. There are a couple of gaps that I wanted to acknowledge, and they're gaps that we're endeavouring to fill in subsequent phases of this research study. Two main ones being we didn't involve any interviewees in this part of the research from Marine Rescue and Coast Guard, and there's a fairly minimal input from ambulance services too, and so they're two things that we'll be looking to correct in subsequent stages. This is just to give you an idea of the questions that we asked people to answer. They're big questions, not easily answered. So a little bit difficult for people, some of them to answer, but people had a great go. So we asked about what's changed in the emergency volunteering landscape over the last 5 to 10 years. What are the key volunteering issues the sector's facing today? What's already happening to address those issues? What a preferred future for emergency volunteering looks like? That is a really difficult question to answer. We tried to ask people to describe that future, so to imagine it and then just describe what it looked like. But people mostly answered that question by describing what needs to be different compared to today, what needs to change, what we need to do. And we sort of extrapolated a view of the preferred future from their answers. We also asked what needs to happen, or what most needs to happen to move towards that future. And we asked about external forces and trends that they think are likely to shape the future and what is most uncertain about the future, because that's a big thing to consider in decision making today when you're considering preparing for a future. What is uncertain. So today, just to keep things a little bit brief, I should say each of these is sort of a heading in the report, and we have a lot more detail under each of those headings in the report. Today I'll talk mostly about number 2, so key volunteering issues the sector's facing today, because sort of understanding of where we need to go and what we need to do to get there, to bring about a preferred future, are really embedded in our understanding of where we are currently at and what the current issues are that we face. I'll just quickly touch on number 4, what a preferred future looks like, just to give you an idea of the things that were emphasised, and also then talk about what most needs to happen to move towards that future. Okay. So nothing that I'm saying here will be a huge surprise to people that are involved in emergency management sector and volunteering. So the 2 big key volunteering issues that that managers emphasised, the big one was volunteer sustainability and the sustainability of their formal volunteers who are affiliated with emergency management organisations, and that sustainability in the face of how the external environment is changing. The second issue they talked about was the need to address the rise of spontaneous volunteering. I'm not touching on that one today, but it is included in the report. I'll just say that every single person who talked about this issue said we need to do something. And they were described various stages of we have started planning for or arranging something to address spontaneous volunteering, or we need to, or we don't know how to, or we have, or we're progressing it, and in more to less positive languages, like with some emphasising the need to manage risk and others emphasising the need to enable the capacity of this spontaneous volunteering to contribute to supporting communities. I should say as well, with that main issue, the volunteer sustainability, there were exceptions to that. So Some people, particularly metropolitan emergency service volunteering, sustainability is quite good. Some of those units have wait lists. And ambulance service volunteering seems to volunteer sustainability is quite good across many of the ambulance services, and also surf lifesaving. So I'm talking kind of painting in a broad picture, but it's not. There's difference and variability in the volunteering issues across the sector. So in order to make sense of what managers were telling us about volunteering and about the key issues for volunteering today, I used the tool of a problem tree. I don't really like the language of problems. I find it quite negative, but I did find this to be quite a useful tool. A problem tree depicts, as you can see there, a core problem that has multiple symptoms or effects and which has roots in numerous contributing factors or causes. And so using a problem tree helps you kind of map out the anatomy of cause and effect around an issue. And I found this really valuable to help me dig into the more underlying factors that managers were talking about, and to go beyond the kind of quite symptom surface layers here that have been discussed more around volunteering in the past, but I'll say a little bit more about that with the next slide. So this is the problem tree that I constructed. So I don't expect you to be able to read all the text in there. This is in the report. I just wanted to show it to you and point out a couple of things. So you see the central problem here. Just switch to a, whoops. Switch to a red dot here. So the core problem here is volunteer sustainability, and that's in the context of how this external environment is changing. Something I found quite interesting is you could say that changes in the external environment were causing a volunteer sustainability problem. So for example, you could say that changes in how people are volunteering and a rise of short-term volunteering is a problem for volunteer sustainability. But managers didn't tend to frame it that way, although there were exceptions. I tended to look at that more as the external environment is changing. In that context, we have an issue with volunteer sustainability, but the causes of that problem were factors that rest more within the emergency management sector than the external environment. So I'll unpack those causes a little bit more in a moment. So they're more things that were internal to the emergency management sector. And I think that is because they took the changing external environment as a given. So our environment is changing, we need to do something about it. If we don't do something about it, if we don't adapt to it, then we have this problem. So our not doing something about it, not adapting to it, that's fundamentally the underlying issue. So some people referred to this volunteer sustainability issue really directly, and others more inferred it by talking about the symptoms or effects of this problem, which are very well known. So they talked about things like aging volunteer base, low or declining numbers of volunteers, growing competition for volunteers' time, either with other organisations or with other activities people have in their life, difficulties in recruitment and retention, particularly in rural areas. They talked about low volunteer diversity, higher than desired dropout rates amongst volunteers, volunteer fatigue and burnout, difficulties in matching volunteers to roles that needed to be filled for the organisation, and low or declining volunteer participation and disengagement from volunteering activity amongst affiliated volunteers. So these are all things that are symptoms. What is interesting to me is if you just look at the symptoms, say an ageing volunteer base, and you don't consider the underlying causes that are down at the bottom of the diagram here, it leads you to certain kinds of solutions that are really band-aid solutions, and a lot of those solutions in the past have been put some money into a new recruitment campaign. So a recruitment campaign that might be targeted at young people. So what we heard quite clearly from managers, and I think comes through when you're using this problem tree tool, is that there are underlying causes that need to be addressed, not just those surface issue symptoms or effects that are most obvious, are more visible on the surface. So what I'm going to do now is just unpack those causes a little bit more, and just touch on each briefly, but introduce them to you. I broke them into 3 levels that represent the levels that managers mostly talked about them. They all interact though across these levels, but the 3 levels were management practices and requirements at the more sort of local level and that direct interface with volunteers. Causal factors that are more to do with the organisation and the context of an organisation as a whole, and then a couple of factors that are to do with the emergency management sector and sort of relationships across the sector. So the first of these, so looking at the management practices and requirements, there were 3 main causal factors that came out of the interviews. Just to show you, I've broken it in here in the diagram. You can see the number of managers from primary response organisations that referred to these and the number from support organisations. So in the report we break up what we found from interviews a little bit more than I'm doing today between and show differences a little bit more between what managers said from primary response organisations and support organisations, because there are some differences. The first causal factor that was clearly emphasised across the board was excessive and inflexible administrative and training demands on volunteers. And this is really tied to a rise of government regulation around things like occupational health and safety, working with children, training requirements, etc. But also tied to sort of the shift towards corporatisation and professionalisation in not just the emergency management sector, but in the wider voluntary sector as well, and shifts in what we expect from volunteer-based services and the level, I guess, the quality of service that's expected by government, by society, of emergency management organisations. And there's a great quote there that I won't read out, but you can have a look through it yourself. It sort of really describes the impacts that can have on volunteers. While it can bring positive things, it can also create barriers and burdens and rapidly rising demands on volunteers' time and commitment. The next 2 causal factors were emphasised more by managers with primary response organisations. The first of those was the misalignment between expectations and experiences of volunteering. And there's 2 key aspects. That one was about how organisations communicate to potential volunteers and the wider public about what it would be like to come and be a part of their organisations as a volunteer. And the other is that now that organisations are looking out further to engage with people who are not from their traditional volunteer base, they're trying to connect with people who've not traditionally been involved in emergency volunteering or emergency management volunteering, who don't know about it through their family and friend connections of others around them being involved in it. So they have less exposure to it. And then the third one was shortfalls in volunteer leadership, in volunteer management and in volunteer support. In some cases that was tied to resourcing, in some cases tied to sort of capacity training, and it's leadership not only by paid staff but also by volunteer leaders who were leading and managing other volunteers as well. So looking at the factors that were described more as sitting at a level of organisation, so there's 4 here. The first, very clearly emphasised by both groups of managers, was narrow, rigid and out-of-date volunteer models. So there's a lot of talk about the need for more flexible volunteering, for more diverse pathways into volunteering, for a wider range of ways that people could contribute as volunteers in emergency management, shorter term, more attention to the life cycle of volunteering and how people have more and less time for volunteering at certain parts of their life, and how organisations can continue to engage with people through that life cycle, or also through mobility, so with people moving from place to place and being able to take their, say, qualifications and experience of volunteering with them from place to place, for example. The next one was emphasised more by managers with primary response organisations, and that was weak or weaker than desired volunteer culture. And that term volunteer culture is my way of sort of wrapping up issues around volunteers feeling rewarded, feeling valued, volunteer contribution being supported with resourcing and support services, with gear, in some cases, with good relationships between paid staff and volunteers, and a good recognition of the role of volunteers, and volunteers being embedded, and volunteering, and a culture of volunteering being embedded across whole organisations. And so some primary managers with primary response organisations said that was not as strong as it needs to be. The next one is resource. Said that was not as strong as it needs to be. The next one is resource constraints. That was emphasised more by managers with support organisations, which is not surprising given that more of them are non-government organisations. However, it was referred to by government or governmental response agencies as well, of not having, not necessarily more resources, but resourcing at the right time and in the right areas to enable good work to be done to support volunteers, to adapt to the changing landscape and do what needed to be done to sort of modernise and adapt organisations. And then the last one was emphasised a little bit more by primary response organisation managers, and that's inadequate connection with communities. So that was connected quite a lot with discussions around lower volunteer diversity, and also about trying to sort of connect with people from different groups in society, and having volunteers and organisations sort of really connected to and representing communities, understanding community risk, knowing what communities need from them, and also being able to recruit and involve people from different segments of society. So the third level, there's two causal factors here you'll see emphasised largely by managers from primary response organisations. The first is overly bureaucratic and siloed service delivery models. When you talk about volunteering with managers, they tend to quite quickly turn to talk about service delivery, which I found interesting. So overly bureaucratic being kind of complicated, slow-moving, not sort of adaptive, responsive to external environments, and siloed, so not as integrated and collaborative as it needs to be. So there's a lot of talk about how this has improved, that there is more integration, there is more collaboration, but that needs to continue further. So that factor is more about relationships within the emergency management sector. The second point there, exclusionary command and control culture and structure, that is more about the emergency management sector and organisations in it not being open to other relationships with other organisations, with community groups, with community sector, with other organisations in other sectors, and being too internal looking, and not engaging as well as they could with other segments of society that could also contribute to and support volunteering and support to communities. Okay, just quickly, this shows you a breakdown of the 6 core elements that managers emphasised as needing to be features of the future of emergency volunteering in order for this volunteer sustainability problem to be overcome. So the first emphasised by most managers was having formal emergency management volunteering that is easier to engage in, that is more accessible and more inclusive. So that's about reducing administrative burden, making it accessible to a wider range of people, for example. The second is about having emergency service delivery or services around emergency management delivered in a really community-centred, collaborative and integrated way. So that's about really targeting services to local community needs and risks, delivered collaboratively with other organisations and groups that support communities and communities themselves, and being very integrated within and across the sector. There's quite a bit of talk about combined services and being more efficient and effective in how services were delivered, particularly in rural communities, so as not to burden volunteers, for example. Third one there is about emergency management organisations becoming more agile, more open, more future focused, more aware of changes and shifts in the external environment and being able to adapt to those more quickly, so being less bureaucratic. Next one is having strong volunteer cultures in organisations, and you'll see there that was emphasised more heavily by managers of primary response organisations. So that reflects also their emphasis on weaker volunteer culture being a problem at the moment. And the fifth one is making greater space for community resilience. So that's about engaging with volunteering that is self-organised, with spontaneous volunteering, community-based initiatives that are not necessarily affiliated with formal emergency management organisations. The number 6 there is volunteering being valued and enabled in Australia, and that one was interesting. It's actually more about wider volunteering and having volunteering being valued by government and by society more widely, so emergency volunteering but also volunteering more broadly, and having an enabling infrastructure for it, so investment and resourcing and guidelines and frameworks that enable volunteering and support volunteer management and coordination. Oh, I should have brought that quote up a little bit earlier. So 29 of the 34 people presented some view of the future. The ones that didn't pretty much all said, I don't know, but it needs to be different from today. So every single person said the future landscape of emergency volunteering needs to be quite significantly different to what we currently have in order for volunteer sustainability to be very good in the future. So this is again, this is a very busy text-heavy diagram, so you don't need to read all the words here. It's in the report. I just wanted to show it to you. So one of my main points with this is that for each of those sort of 6 areas or characteristics that people emphasised as needing to be present in the future landscape of emergency volunteering, there were quite a lot of things that they showed that could be done to bring those about. And I think that is a very positive thing. They identified either directly or indirectly a whole host of things that could be done, that are beginning to be done, that some organisations or areas are already starting to do or have already implemented that can support bringing about this preferred future. So there's a whole host of stuff in there that I won't go through. I don't want to keep you too long. The most important ones for me are the ones down the bottom here that I've called cross-cutting areas. So these are things that sort of enable other activities to happen. So these are sort of the core enabling priority areas, I would say. And so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those. First is around having strong leadership for change and a strong direction for change. Next one is about being able to share learning and evidence of what works and being aware of what works and seeking out information about what works and what is best practice. The third one there is resourcing appropriately. Like I said, not necessarily about we want more and more money, but we want the right money in the right places to enable a good volunteering infrastructure and volunteering support. The next one is interesting, I'll touch on it a little bit more in a moment, is the balancing risk management with the need for change. And then the last one is change in culture and doing it carefully. There's a really strong recognition that the kinds of changes that are needed to prepare for the future, to support a good, positive vibrant, sustainable volunteering in the future will require some culture change. There's also a lot of recognition that this needs to be driven from not to be sort of head office and HQ saying you need to do this, but it being the change being embedded across organisations and being driven from the bottom up. And for that, and also recognition that culture and identity is really important in the volunteering space, and that any change needs to be managed very carefully with respect for that identity and history and legacy. So just to touch on that issue of risk management again, it really came through that there is a tension between the need to balance risk and what is, I guess you should say, quite a risk-averse sector in general, but also the need to open up to change, to enable change to happen. So we've got there's some great quotes around this. I've just picked out two here. So the first, I think we need to not say no, but find better ways to regulate resilient, reactive, responsible, supportive communities. And then the second quote, they're talking about sort of risk-averse regulations, processes, procedures, and that these things make gains for safety, but they come at a cost when it comes to volunteering and enabling change to happen. So I wanted just to finish up here my last slide. It's easy to talk about challenges in this area. I want to finish up by talking about some opportunities. And there's others that you'd be able to identify, and I'm sure if you thought about it, you could come up with some of your own. These are the ones that stood out to me from the interviews. So one is an opportunity there through the emergency management sector engaging more with the wider voluntary sector. So a lot of opportunity for EM to contribute to discussions and things that were happening in the voluntary sector for volunteer involving organisations to address how the environment is changing around volunteering, but also for EM to learn from the experiences of others in other parts of the voluntary sector. Second one there is learning more from smaller and less populous jurisdictions and regions and areas where some of the challenges and shifts and changes have perhaps been a little bit more extreme or evident or intense, and so some changes have already happened and things have already been tried that other organisations or other areas could learn from that stuff that has already happened. Further expanding on the partnerships and collaborations that are already developing is another key area. So there is a lot of activity in the development of new partnerships and new collaborations, and in all cases where that's happened, people have said new and positive and good things have come of it. So further expanding on those is a great opportunity. Another one is learning from the experiences of frontrunners. So there's organisations and groups that are doing some great work. Some of the examples people referred to in interviews are listed in the report as well as examples. So watching what those front runners are doing and learning from their experiences and I guess learning from best practice in change and adaptation, there's a great opportunity there if those lessons can be shared more widely. Another opportunity in better communicating the value, the contributions and the costs of volunteering and of volunteer management. And that really goes to that, I think, sixth characteristic of the preferred future of having volunteering that is valued, that is resourced, of having an enabling infrastructure that supports volunteering and the changes and adaptations needed to support volunteering well into the future. And the last one there is probably the most important, focusing conversations about change on service to community. Commitment to serving communities is really high and really strong amongst volunteers in the emergency management sector and across the voluntary sector broadly. Also, when you're talking about shifts and changes in people's motivations around volunteering, Commitment to contributing to community remains really high. How people want to or are able to do that is changing. But commitment to contributing to community remains high. So there's a great opportunity to focus conversations around change and opportunity and trialling and piloting new things that is focused on enabling people to contribute to their community. So that's it from me. As I said, the report, if it is not out already, will be very shortly. Being a re-recorded webinar, we don't have live questions here. There were a couple of good questions raised on the 5th of February when we did this as a live webinar that I'll just quickly put to you. So one of them was, how did the front runners get the impetus to be front runners? So what do you need to have in place in order to try out new opportunities? And when answering that question, I really referred back to those cross-cutting areas that's on that kind of very texty diagram I showed you about having strong leadership for change, sharing learning and evidence, having appropriate resourcing, having a more balanced approach to risk management with the need to make change and enable change, and being aware that culture change is needed, but that it needs to be actively and carefully and respectfully managed. Were key parts of that. And then we had another question. It said, so some of the solutions require advocacy, and the question was curious about who the emergency management sector would see as their key advocacy body for solutions around volunteering. And a couple of the responses from people attending the webinar, a couple of the answers to that question included the Australian Emergency Management Volunteer Forum, or Emergency Management Australia, or Volunteering Australia. And I think it raises a really good point about how the EM sector can advocate for change around volunteering and who and how that can happen, because I think that's a really good point. Some of the solutions do require advocacy for change, say to government or other elements of within emergency management sector, but also government more widely. So there are two really good questions. So just a bit of more info there. The report will be available through that short link I've put up. More information about our research project also available from the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre website. The Emergency Volunteering Shared Learning Network has a brand new homepage through MailChimp that you can access there, and if you're interested in signing up, there's a link there to sign up to receive newsletters from us through that network, and to hear about upcoming webinars, and my contact details if there is anything you want to follow up, or if you would like to ask me to provide you copies of reports, etc., etc. They're available there. So thank you very much for your time. I've taken up more time than I expected, so you've got a little bit more detailed run through of what's in that report than we did in the live webinar. I hope it was worthwhile. Very pleased to hear feedback and comments on that report. If you have a chance to have a look at it, as soon as it's available, we'll pass it on through the network newsletter. So thank you very much for your time today, and goodbye. We'll see you at the next webinar.